The outpost was all she knew, a solitary station, tucked away on a barren world where nothing had stirred for centuries. The land stretched out in all directions, a desolate wasteland with charred ground and skeletal remnants of long-fallen structures. A faint wind carried dust across the ruins, and her armor, dull and worn, creaked with each movement as she patrolled the perimeter out of habit rather than necessity. Her purpose had long faded, yet she remained, bound by duty to watch over a place that had been forgotten by everyone else. Once, this outpost was alive. She remembered faint images, fragments of battles and conversations shared with comrades who stood by her side, laughter that echoed through the cold metal corridors. Those memories were faded, like echoes bouncing off the walls of her mind. Time had taken its toll, and she was no longer sure if they were memories or dreams conjured to fill the silence. Her duty was to guard, to protect, but from what, she no longer knew. There was no enemy left to fight, no command left to obey. Just the silence, punctuated by the soft hum of failing machinery and the distant crackle of energy conduits sparking to life briefly before fizzling out. Her sensors, dulled by time, still swept the horizon in a mechanical rhythm. Days blurred into each other, each identical to the last. She was alone in every sense of the word. Metal rusted, systems decayed, and her once gleaming armor, designed to inspire and intimidate, was now pockmarked and faded. Yet she stayed, anchored to her duty, though the purpose was lost, as if letting go would mean admitting that everything she once stood for had vanished. Then, one day, a blip appeared on her radar, faint at first, almost too weak to detect. Her system struggled to make sense of it, flickering with the effort as they worked to analyze and categorize the incoming signal. She felt a stir within herself, a long-forgotten feeling that she couldn't place, a sense of anticipation mixed with trepidation. The blip grew stronger, resolving into the unmistakable outline of a small spacecraft descending through the atmosphere, fighting against the thick clouds of dust that cloaked the sky. It was something new, something alive in this dead place. As the ship descended, she felt her body tense, an automatic response drilled into her by training she barely remembered. She took her position, hidden in the shadows of the outpost, her hand instinctively gripping the hilt of her weapon, though it had been centuries since she had wielded it in battle. She didn't know if this visitor was friend or foe, but for the first time in countless years, she felt a flicker of purpose, a reason to be alert. The ship landed with a low hum, its engines whining as they powered down. The silence settled again, heavier this time, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She watched, her gaze unblinking, as the hatch opened, and a figure stepped out, a human. He looked around, eyes scanning the broken landscape, his face half covered by a breathing mask. He was cautious, moving slowly, his posture wary yet curious. He was dressed in practical, worn clothing, marked by signs of long travel. There was no weapon in his hand, only a device that he held up, occasionally glancing at it as if it were guiding him. For a long time, she stayed hidden, watching him from the shadows. He took slow, deliberate steps, his gaze tracing the lines of the outpost, studying the faded insignia on the walls, the decayed remnants of equipment strewn around. His presence unsettled her, stirring up emotions she thought she had forgotten, suspicion, curiosity, a faint, lingering hope that someone had finally come for her. Yet she held back, uncertain of his intentions. Why would anyone come here, to a place abandoned and forgotten by time itself? The human stopped, seemingly sensing her presence. He didn't turn to face her directly but instead spoke, his voice soft yet clear in the stillness. "I know you're here. I've heard stories about you. A guardian, a soldier left behind, waiting." His words were calm, respectful, as if he knew the weight of speaking in this silent, hallowed ground. She felt a surge of conflicted emotions, relief that he wasn't hostile, irritation that he spoke to her like a legend, a relic of the past. She stepped forward, letting the light fall upon her worn armor, and he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite place, something between awe and sadness. His eyes traveled over her, taking in the state of her armor, the signs of wear and tear, the scars of battles long past. He didn't flinch, didn't react with fear or pity, only quiet understanding. He introduced himself, a name she didn't recognize, though he seemed to think it mattered. He explained that he was an explorer, a seeker of forgotten histories, and that he'd traveled far to find her. He'd come across stories of her existence, legends told by those who barely remembered the outpost or its purpose, fragments passed down over generations. She listened in silence, letting his words wash over her, processing each one carefully. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice rough from disuse. It was a simple question, yet it carried the weight of her existence. Why had he come? Why did he care? He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Because your story deserves to be remembered. You deserve to be remembered. You're part of us, part of humanity's journey across the stars. I wanted to see for myself if the stories were true, if there was truly someone here, still waiting." His words were quiet but sincere, and for a moment, she felt a crack in the armor she'd built around her heart. She didn't know whether to believe him, but his presence, his acknowledgement, felt like a balm to the loneliness she'd carried for so long. She didn't respond, instead turning away, her mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. Could she trust him? Could she allow herself to hope, after all this time? She felt torn, bound by the duty that had kept her here for so long, yet pulled by the desire to leave, to find something beyond this desolate place. He didn't press her, didn't demand answers. Instead, he began to speak again, sharing stories of the galaxy beyond, tales of worlds she'd never seen, civilizations that had risen and fallen, and the enduring spirit of humanity that continued to spread among the stars. She listened, captivated despite herself. Each story chipped away at her defenses, each word a reminder of what she had once known but had long forgotten. She found herself speaking, haltingly at first, sharing fragments of her own story. She told him of the battles she remembered, the comrades who had once stood beside her, the purpose that had once burned bright within her. Her words were rusty, her memories faded, but he listened with the same quiet respect, never interrupting, never questioning. He was patient, letting her find her voice, her history, as if he understood that this was as much for her as it was for him. And for the first time in centuries, she felt something shift within her, a faint, fragile spark that had been buried under layers of duty and solitude. She didn't know if she could trust him fully, but for now, she would allow him to stay, to continue speaking of the worlds beyond and reminding her that there was life, vibrant and boundless, beyond the confines of this desolate planet. The silence stretched between them, a fragile, almost sacred thing in this forgotten world. She watched him, standing there in the ruins of her outpost, a living connection to the humanity she'd lost so long ago. Her mind raced, torn between the instinct to retreat, to stay hidden and alone, and the pull of his presence, so genuine, so alive. His stories lingered in her thoughts, stirring memories and emotions she'd buried beneath layers of purpose and protocol. She was wary, but something about his steady gaze, the quiet respect in his voice, made her want to listen. Against her better judgment, she allowed herself to stay, to listen a bit longer. He began to explore the outpost, his steps careful and measured, as though he understood the gravity of each fragment he examined. The outpost was filled with relics of her past, a shattered helmet here, a rusted weapon there. She watched him move from one object to another, curiosity evident in the way he studied each piece, but never with the greedy look of a scavenger. Instead, it was as if he was paying homage, honoring the remnants of battles she could barely recall. At one point he paused, holding a broken insignia in his hands, running his fingers over its faded emblem. "Did this mean something to you?" he asked, his voice soft. She hesitated, torn between the urge to respond and the instinct to remain silent. But the question tugged at something inside her, and she found herself speaking almost involuntarily. "It was a mark of loyalty," she murmured, barely recognizing her own voice. "A symbol of belonging." The words felt foreign on her tongue, like relics themselves, unearthed from a distant past. She struggled to explain further, realizing how little she truly remembered about what this symbol had once meant to her. Yet, somehow, she wanted him to understand, to know that once she had been part of something larger, something meaningful. He nodded, listening without judgment, as though he understood the weight of her memories even if he couldn't fully grasp their significance. His patience surprised her. He asked no probing questions, only offered quiet, attentive silence, allowing her to unearth her thoughts at her own pace. For the first time, she felt that perhaps her story mattered, even if only to this lone traveler. His presence, his willingness to listen, lent a strange validity to the memories she had guarded so fiercely, even as they faded within her. As they continued to move through the outpost together, she began to share more, fragments of battles she'd fought, comrades who had once stood beside her, their faces blurred by time. She spoke of the oaths she had taken, the unyielding sense of duty that had anchored her here long after everyone else had left or perished. He listened, never interrupting, his expression a mix of respect and sadness. She found herself drawn to his quiet empathy, his genuine curiosity. It was a balm to her solitude, a reminder that maybe, just maybe, there was still a place for her beyond this desolate world. Her heart stirred with an unfamiliar sensation, a longing she could barely recognize. The idea of leaving had never occurred to her before, had never even been a possibility in her mind. This outpost, this ruined shell of a once proud station, was her entire world. But now, with him beside her, she could feel the pull of something greater, a world beyond her duty, beyond her isolation. The thought terrified her, yet it also brought a glimmer of hope, fragile but real. He paused in front of a long dead console, a relic of her past life, and began to examine it with a careful eye. She watched, curiosity piqued as he tinkered with a small device, connecting it to the console's ancient circuits. With a few adjustments, he managed to coax a faint flicker of light from the screen, a ghostly glow that illuminated his face and cast shadows across the room. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant, yet it struck her deeply, a reminder that there was still life, still a spark, within these forgotten walls. Without a word, he gestured to her, inviting her to sit beside him, to watch as he coaxed remnants of data from the console. Hesitantly, she took a seat, her armor creaking with age, and together they watched as fragments of information flashed across the screen, old logs, images of battles, maps of territories she had once known like the back of her hand. She could barely recognize them now, yet seeing them brought a strange sense of peace, a feeling that the past was still there, still alive in some small way. As they sifted through the data, he asked her about the battles she'd fought, the places she'd defended, and slowly, she began to open up, sharing stories she hadn't spoken of in centuries. She told him about the comrades she'd lost, the scars she bore, the victories and defeats that had shaped her. Each story was a piece of herself she hadn't realized she still held onto, fragments she'd thought had long faded away. Yet, with each word, she felt a little less alone, a little less bound to the empty walls around her. He listened with rapt attention, his eyes never leaving hers, and she found herself speaking more freely, sharing thoughts and memories she hadn't dared to revisit in ages. She didn't know why she was telling him all of this, only that it felt right. It felt as if, by sharing her story, she was finally allowing herself to let go of the weight she'd carried for so long. His presence was an anchor, a reminder that she wasn't just a relic, a ghost bound to a forgotten world. She was still alive, still capable of feeling, of connecting, even if only with this lone traveler. At one point, he reached out, his hand resting gently on her armor, a gesture of reassurance, of solidarity. She felt a shock run through her, a jolt of something she couldn't quite name. It had been so long since she'd felt human touch, even through the cold metal that encased her. His touch was gentle, grounding her, reminding her of a world beyond duty, beyond isolation. She looked at him, searching his face for any hint of mockery or pity, but found only understanding, a quiet empathy that made her chest ache with something she hadn't felt in ages, a yearning to belong. He withdrew his hand, and the moment passed, but its impact lingered, a subtle yet profound shift in her heart. She could feel the walls she'd built around herself beginning to crack, the rigid shell of duty that had kept her confined to this desolate place starting to loosen. She didn't fully understand it, but for the first time, she felt as if she could trust him, as if he was someone who saw her not as a relic or a legend, but as a person. In the quiet that followed, he shared more stories of the galaxy, tales of vibrant worlds and thriving communities, of humanity's unyielding drive to explore, to connect, to remember those who had come before. His words painted pictures in her mind, scenes of bustling cities and star-filled skies, places she'd never seen but could almost imagine now, thanks to his descriptions. She realized, with a mixture of awe and sadness, how much she had missed, how much of life had passed her by as she remained bound to this place, clinging to a duty that had long lost its meaning. Yet, as he spoke, she felt a spark reignite within her, a small, tentative hope that maybe she could be part of something again, that there was still a place for her in the vast, infinite galaxy he described. The thought was terrifying, yet exhilarating, a promise of freedom she hadn't dared to dream of before. In that moment, she made a silent decision. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that she couldn't go back to the way things were, couldn't return to the empty silence of this outpost, not after meeting him, not after feeling that spark again. She looked at him, her gaze steady, and for the first time, she felt a sense of purpose beyond duty, beyond loyalty to a cause that no longer existed. Perhaps, she thought, her story wasn't over yet. Perhaps, with him, she could find a new beginning. She could feel the weight of her decision settling over her, a mixture of fear and exhilaration as she prepared to leave the outpost for the first time in centuries. The human traveler's words lingered in her mind, his descriptions of the galaxy sparking images she'd never dared to imagine. He had shown her a glimpse of life beyond the bleak confines of this place, a life where she could be more than just a remnant of a forgotten duty. The thought was both freeing and terrifying. She glanced back at the walls of the outpost, a fortress that had held her for so long, and for the first time, felt the urge to break free, to step into the unknown. The traveler sensed her resolve, and together they began to prepare for their departure. He worked methodically, explaining each step as he checked the condition of her systems, making minor adjustments to her armor and enhancing her sensors. She watched him in silence, surprised by his quiet efficiency, his attention to detail. He handled her armor with care, treating it not as a relic but as something worthy of respect. His hands moved with practiced skill, yet he showed a gentleness she hadn't expected, as though he understood the significance of each scar, each dent that marked her history. As they worked, he shared stories of other worlds, of challenges he had faced, of allies and enemies he had encountered along the way. She listened, captivated by his experiences, by the resilience and adaptability of humanity. His stories painted a picture of a galaxy that was vast, beautiful, and brutal in equal measure, a place where survival required both strength and compassion. She felt an odd sense of pride, realizing that despite everything, despite centuries of isolation, she was still connected to this legacy, still part of something greater. But just as she began to envision a future beyond the outpost, a warning signal echoed through her sensors, a faint, persistent alarm that sent a chill down her spine. She recognized it instantly, the unmistakable sound of approaching enemies. Her body tensed, instincts honed over centuries snapping into place. She turned to the traveler, her voice sharp. "We're not alone." He froze, his expression shifting from calm to alert in an instant. Together, they scanned the perimeter, and soon, the source of the disturbance became clear, an automated patrol, remnants of her old adversaries, reactivated by their presence. They had lain dormant, forgotten like her, but now they stirred, drawn by the energy signatures of her systems, by the faint pulse of life that had dared to reawaken in this desolate place. The traveler's eyes narrowed, and he assessed the threat with the practiced eye of someone who had seen battle before. He looked to her, a question in his gaze, and she nodded, understanding that they would have to face this together. For the first time in centuries, she readied herself for combat, feeling a surge of adrenaline that was both familiar and foreign. She hadn't fought in so long, yet her body remembered, her movements precise and fluid as she activated her weapons systems, checking each function with an efficiency that surprised even her. The enemy patrol advanced, cold and mechanical, remnants of an army that had once been her sworn foe. They moved in formation, their movements synchronized, their purpose clear, to eliminate any intruders. She took a step forward, positioning herself between the traveler and the approaching threat. She would protect him. She would not allow him to fall here, not after he had given her hope, a reason to fight once more. The battle was swift and brutal. Her reflexes, though rusty, kicked in, muscle memory guiding her movements. She dodged and struck with precision, each movement calculated, each strike efficient. The traveler moved beside her, improvising with what little he had, scavenged weapons, quick thinking, and a fearlessness that impressed her. They fought in unison, their actions coordinated in a way that felt natural, as if they had been allies for far longer than a mere few days. At one point, he was nearly overwhelmed, but she stepped in, her armor shielding him from the blast of an enemy weapon. She felt the impact reverberate through her, the force almost enough to knock her off balance, but she held firm, anchoring herself to protect him. He glanced at her, a mix of gratitude and determination in his eyes, and they pressed on, driving back the patrol, eliminating one enemy after another until the last machine fell, its circuits fried, its body collapsing into a heap of metal and sparks. As the dust settled, they stood in the silence, breathing heavily, the weight of the moment sinking in. She felt a strange sense of pride, a reminder of who she once was, of the warrior she had been. Fighting beside him had reignited something within her, a fierce loyalty, a drive to protect that she hadn't felt in centuries. She looked at the traveler, his face streaked with dirt, a satisfied grin on his face despite the exhaustion in his eyes. She realized then that she wasn't just fighting for survival, she was fighting for him, for the bond they had forged in the midst of battle. The traveler reached out, clasping her shoulder in a gesture of camaraderie, and she felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of belonging she hadn't known she craved. For so long, she had been alone, bound to a purpose that no longer mattered, but now, she was part of something again. She was not just a guardian of a forgotten outpost, she was his ally, his protector, and perhaps, his friend. He took a step back, studying her, his gaze thoughtful. "I couldn't have done that without you," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. She felt an odd mix of pride and humility, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to praise, to recognition. For centuries, her actions had gone unseen, her loyalty unacknowledged, but now, here he was, looking at her with respect, with gratitude. It was a strange feeling, one she wasn't quite sure how to process. He handed her a small token, something he had kept in his pack, a simple metal emblem, polished and worn, bearing the symbol of his people. "Consider this a mark of our alliance," he said, his tone light yet sincere. She took it, feeling the weight of the gesture, understanding that it was more than just a token. It was a symbol of trust, a promise that they were in this together. She fastened it to her armor, a silent declaration that she was no longer alone, no longer bound to this place by duty alone. As they gathered their supplies, preparing to leave the outpost behind, she felt a sense of liberation, a freedom she hadn't known was possible. She looked around one last time, taking in the familiar walls, the shadows that had been her only companions for so long. This place, once her entire world, now felt small, confined, like a cage she was finally escaping. The traveler watched her, sensing the significance of the moment, but he said nothing, allowing her the silence to process her farewell. She felt a mixture of sorrow and relief, a weight lifting from her shoulders as she turned away from the outpost, stepping forward into the unknown. She didn't know what awaited her, didn't know if she would find peace, or purpose, or even danger. But with him beside her, she felt ready to face whatever came next. They walked side by side, their footsteps in sync, a silent rhythm that spoke of trust, of shared purpose. She glanced at him, the weight of the battles, the isolation, all fading away with each step they took together. She was no longer bound to a duty that had lost its meaning, no longer chained to a purpose that no longer served her. She was free, and for the first time, she felt alive. And as they left the outposts behind, stepping out into the vast expanse of the world beyond, she realized that she was not just a guardian, not just a soldier. She was something more, something undefined, but wholly hers. The world receded behind them, the outpost dwindling into a mere shadow as they moved farther from the only home she'd ever known. The silence of the wasteland stretched before them, vast and indifferent, yet she felt something stirring within, a sense of possibility that had eluded her for so long. She walked beside the traveler, their steps falling in sync, each one carrying her farther from her past, closer to a future she couldn't yet imagine. The air was thick with dust, the landscape barren, but with him by her side, it felt strangely alive. He occasionally glanced over at her, gauging her reaction, but he offered no words of sympathy or encouragement, only a quiet presence that allowed her to process the enormity of her decision. She felt an odd sense of grief mixed with relief, a subtle ache for the life she was leaving behind, even as she embraced the unknown ahead. Her heart felt lighter with each step, the weight of duty that had once kept her anchored dissipating into the air around them. After a while, he broke the silence, sharing more tales of his travels, of worlds she could barely comprehend, lush planets with skies so vast they swallowed the stars, cities that glowed in the darkness, and cultures that thrived despite the challenges of the galaxy. His words painted a vision of humanity she had never known, a tapestry woven with resilience, ingenuity, and a hunger for connection. She listened, mesmerized, feeling her understanding of the galaxy expand with each story. He spoke of humanity's triumphs and failures with equal reverence, describing battles won and lost, alliances forged, and sacrifices made in the name of exploration. She realized, listening to him, that she had always thought of herself as separate, isolated by her duty. Yet his stories reminded her that humanity's strength lay not just in survival, but in unity, in the bonds forged across vast distances and impossible odds. She felt a flicker of pride in being part of this legacy, even as a relic. Perhaps, she thought, her time of service hadn't been wasted after all. Their journey continued in silence for a time, her thoughts turning inward, unraveling the layers of herself she had kept hidden, even from her own mind. She was beginning to understand something fundamental. Her duty, once so rigid, had been a part of her humanity, but it hadn't defined it. Her loyalty, her resolve, her willingness to protect, these traits were what had connected her to humanity, even in isolation. She hadn't been a mere instrument of war, she had been a guardian, a protector, not because it was demanded of her, but because it was part of who she was. The realization brought a strange sense of peace, a quiet acceptance that softened the sharp edges of her grief. She was no longer bound to a singular purpose. She was free to forge her own path, to choose her own loyalties. And as she glanced at the traveler, she knew that he had given her this gift, not through persuasion or force, but by simply seeing her, by acknowledging her existence in a way that no one else had. He had reminded her that she was more than a relic, more than a soldier. She was, in her own way, still human. Eventually, they reached the traveler's ship, a modest vessel with weathered hull plating and a cockpit filled with an assortment of worn, well-loved equipment. It wasn't the grand starships of her time, but it was sturdy, and there was an undeniable warmth to it, as if it had been crafted with care rather than efficiency. She hesitated for a moment, standing at the edge of the boarding ramp, feeling a rush of emotions that she couldn't quite articulate. The traveler noticed her hesitation and turned, his gaze meeting hers with a gentle understanding. He didn't try to reassure her, didn't tell her that everything would be all right. Instead, he simply held out his hand, an invitation rather than an expectation. She looked at his hand, the warmth of his gesture contrasting with the cold metal of her own, and for a brief moment she remembered what it felt like to be part of something, to trust, to believe. With a quiet resolve, she reached out, her hand closing around his. It was a small gesture, yet it felt monumental, a bridge between her past and her future. As they boarded the ship, she felt a sense of belonging settle over her, a fragile yet undeniable connection that made her feel less like an outcast, and more like a part of something meaningful. Inside the cockpit, he took the controls, his movements fluid and practiced, and she settled into the co-pilot's seat, watching him with a quiet fascination. She had expected to feel out of place, an intruder in his world, but instead, she felt an odd sense of ease, as if this was where she was meant to be. The hum of the engines filled the air, a low, comforting vibration that resonated through her, grounding her in the present. As the ship lifted off, breaking free from the planet's gravity, she felt a weight leave her chest, a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying. The outposts, the battles, the centuries of solitude, they all fell away, becoming distant memories as the planet receded below them, fading into the vast expanse of space. She watched in silence, a faint sense of nostalgia mingling with relief as she let go of the life she had known, embracing the unknown ahead. The stars stretched out before them, infinite and untouched, a vast canvas of possibilities. She felt a surge of wonder, a sense of freedom that filled her with an unexpected joy. The galaxy was vast, and for the first time, she felt like she had a place in it, not as a relic or a guardian, but as herself. The traveler glanced over at her, a hint of a smile on his face, and she felt a warmth spread through her, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond they shared. He began to speak, sharing his plans, his hopes, his vision for the future. She listened, captivated, feeling the threads of her new life begin to weave themselves into something tangible, something real. She wasn't sure where this journey would take her, wasn't sure of what lay ahead, but she knew, deep within her, that she was ready to face it. For so long, she had been defined by duty, by loyalty to a cause that had faded into history. But now, with the stars before her and the traveler by her side, she realized that she had the freedom to redefine herself, to choose her own path. The thought was exhilarating, filling her with a quiet, determined resolve. She was no longer bound to the past. She was free to create her own future, to carve out a place for herself in the galaxy. As they traveled through the star-strewn darkness, she felt a peace settle over her, a gentle calm that softened the edges of her memories. She wasn't alone anymore. She had found a kindred spirit, someone who saw her for who she was, someone who believed in her worth. And in that belief, she found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The journey stretched ahead of them, a series of unknowns, but she no longer felt afraid. She had faced centuries of solitude, the weight of a purpose that had lost its meaning, and had come out the other side with a newfound sense of self. She was ready to embrace whatever came next, to step into the vastness of the galaxy with open eyes and an open heart. And as she looked out at the stars, she felt a quiet gratitude, a sense of wonder that she had almost forgotten. She was no longer a guardian of a forgotten world, no longer a relic bound to duty. She was a traveler now, an explorer, a part of humanity's legacy, and for the first time in centuries, she felt truly alive.